think it's 90.
Okay. So we'll try to do around 45, 50 minutes of conversation and the rest up for Q&A. That's fine? Okay, so Caro Hoffmann.
Recording. Someone recording.
I'm recording.
Okay, great. All right.
Thank you.
Caro Hoffmann is from the Interventionist Left, which is an association of radical left-wing groups and individuals from the undogmatic emancipatory left in German-speaking countries. The IL has been active for over 20 years in social, anti-racist, feminist, and climate struggles, and are committed to anti-fascism and anti-war politics. Their practice ranges from transformative organization and tenant struggles to campaigns of mass civil disobedience against coal mining. And so now I'll introduce Platypus. Platypus was founded in 2006-2007 around the anti-Iraq war protests. Platypus is hosting panel conversations, reading groups in countries in Europe, sometimes Asia and North America, as well as sometimes South America. And we're also publishing a newspaper monthly, or 10 issues a month, the Platypus Review, which is open to articles, interviews, and reviews from all of the people who feel they are connected to the historical left. And we also publish 4 to 6 issues in a German language version. But now, let's go in medias res. Hi, Caro, thanks for being here. How did you become politicized and when?
That's a great question. First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for having me. I'll go further into your question in just a second. I think just for me up front it would be interesting to know who here is from Platypus. Can I see a show of hands? So basically all of you guys, or almost all of you. And who of you guys has ever heard of the Interventionist Left? Okay, so why am I here? Well, that's great. That's really good for me to know, to also just to kind of assess whether I really need to give a general introduction or whether I can also just dive a bit further into our politics. How did I become politicized? I think I had a very I think my way into politics was kind of made out for me early on because my dad was part of the Communist Party in Germany, in West Germany. So for me, I had quite a leftist upbringing. Communist ideas were quite common in our household. My entire family voted for the left, so I don't know, it was easy to just dive into it. But I think my first really transformative experience was Occupy, actually, because I'm from Frankfurt, so in all the big centers of capitalism, which Frankfurt is the major stock exchange, is just a symbol, or a great symbol for. Occupy was quite big around there, so I think when I was quite maybe 15, 16, I went to one of these protests and I was like, oh my god. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been or have been part of that, but just seeing people just taking space up on the street, I found really interesting. And even though I didn't really, I just kind of oh, so they're against the banks. What does it mean? I've got no clue. But I never really went deep into that. I just kind of I liked the adrenaline of it, and I think that kind of also shaped my way into activism. And I mainly sought out activists or political experience that would push my adrenaline for quite a while, and I really got into political theory. So I think a few years later, 5 or 6, I started being part of Ende Gelände, which is, have you guys heard of Ende Gelände? Seeing general nods, I can explain it to the people
Germans
in the back.
Are nodding.
Yeah, the Germans are nodding. So Ende Gelände is this huge alliance in Germany of radical, not only radical leftists. I feel it's an alliance that differs from radical leftists who are more on the autonomous or anarchist spectrum up to NGOs. You basically have everything. and they block coal mines. They try to target big coal companies, and by blocking them for days with like, I think the biggest action was like 7,000 people. They try to do damage to these kind of companies, and I think that was like really made me think of like, okay, so Ende Gelände is like ecological activism. I was like, okay, I can agree with that. I don't really like climate change. And then I also, because Ende Gelände is one of the few organizations that really have like this anti-capitalist point of view in Germany, which is kind of rare. And so I kind of started just getting into that, and then I got into theory for a bit more, and I was like, oh, okay, so that's Marx, and that's like anti-capitalism, and that's how it's all related. And I felt like a few years later, after I felt like Ende Gelände's theory wasn't really deep, or it didn't really have like a body of theory. It wasn't, I don't know, just I felt like it was limited in that way. I started getting into the EEL, who I've met there. And I was like, oh, so those are like the leftist radicals, those are the people that I want to meet. And then I've been in the EEL ever since. That was quite a long answer. I hope that's fine.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Maybe one follow-up question. Was there like an alternative to the interventionist left? Or was it like, did you pick the group like in comparison, so to speak, with other like possibilities or engagement? Or was there something, were they the only game in town? Or was it like something specific about them which you felt spoke to you?
Yeah. I think, to be honest, there was no alternative for me at that time, because I met people from here in Ende Gelände, and they were the only people who I kind of felt like what they were doing politically made sense, that they were organized, they were structured, they helped like people who were like, was really like the first time of activism, trying to find the English word for that, just like young activists basically. They gave a shape and like a structure to everything, which I really admired, and I was like, oh, okay. So because I was really tired of these like sort of like random, maybe slightly anarchist plenaries where everybody was just like talking over each other, and I don't know, I've kind of felt like we're just diving into deep discussions that were like really not worth the time. And they brought a sort of like efficiency and like an agency to it that I really admired. But at the same time, that's something that I nowadays even criticize, because it sounds really neoliberal when you think of it. But back then it was really, really helpful. So they were the ones that I really felt like, okay, I enjoy working with them the most. They seem like they've got a lot of knowledge, and what was also really special about them, I found, was that they don't only work in like the climate discourse. The EA offers like the possibility to be part of the climate struggle, but also of like tenant struggles, anti-racist struggles. So I was just kind of tired of only working just in like climate activism. I was really bored of it, and I felt like it was limited. So that's why I went there. But also I kind of felt like there was no alternative in Leipzig. Like I live in the east of Germany, where the leftist generation, or like there's a huge break between like older leftists who are like part of the democratic, can somebody help me, or what's the English word for the DDR? GDR, thank you very much. Because a lot of people who used to be leftists are like very alienated from being leftists, or have maybe even made like a right turn nowadays, and very young activists. So I don't know, it's just really, really hard to have like a leftist culture there. And so I kind of felt like that was the only group who also had like age difference in them, except for like really like these very like Stalinist groups. So I had to go there. There was no alternative.
So you 2 points I'd like to ask you on this. Like you said there is like seems to be a split in Leipzig, and
Yeah.
if I understood it or correctly, right, like you said, it's kind of generational
Yeah.
overall, and like older leftists feel alienated. Can you speak about how you think they're feeling alienated? What are they feeling alienated from, and how far do you have the impression that the IL at least somehow tries to manage this in having like a broader spectrum of intergenerational membership?
Yes. I believe, or that's very personal point of view, but from what I've witnessed is that back in the GDR, the people who were like against the system back then, they also really, for a good reason, rejected ideas like socialism nowadays. They're like, okay, that's really what, like, that's what caged us. That's what really limited us in a lot of ways. So when you talk to them about like, you know, like what I would call like basic leftist core values like socialism and just redistribution of goods in many ways, or like anti-privatization, they kind of feel like, oh, you're going to take all of that, what we fought for, you're going to take all of that away. So what like the newer generation of the leftists is like fighting for, again, in many ways, if you talk about like socialization in the terms of like redistribution of goods and stuff like that, they kind of feel like, oh, we can't touch that. So it's really hard to push like the topics of like new leftist generations there, and some of them, if it was like people who were just like mainly into more like a leftist populism kind of thing, just like us against like up them, or them, the rich, basically, they really started falling into, or they're really going for like right-wing populism in many ways. Like a lot of them vote for the AfD now, for example, or like really like the not sure if that's the right word, but the migration of people who used to vote for the left, who are now voting for the right, is just massive, especially in Saxony, where I'm from. Like this year, as many of you guys probably know, we're like having elections, and it looks like our right-wing party is just gonna, I don't know, be in charge of the county that I'm living in, and it's scary as fuck. So.
Do you talk about this in the IL? Like, I guess so, right? Like, because as we've already said, anti-fascism is the focus of your work, and I know, right? Like, because I remember I was at Occupy Frankfurt, and
really?
I now also live in Leipzig, right? Like, so we're stereotypical leftists, I guess. And
all the people move from Frankfurt to Leipzig because they're like, it's so alternative.
Yeah, like, and I'm even more stereotypical, right? Like, I made a stop in Berlin in between. Let's get to more interesting stuff. Like, so anti-fascism is a big thing, I think, with the interventionist left. I think it came up like probably after, you know, like Occupy, then the Euro crisis.
Yes.
There was solidarity with Greece, I know, right? Like the IL was also engaged in this, like maybe a parallel project, right? Like the Ums Ganze Alliance in Germany was also working in this sector. They worked together in Occupy before. Yeah. And then I think, right, like with the refugee crisis starting in 2015, this was when like the anti-fascism like started with this campaign of like where it was like we need to fight the AfD now, and I think it was something, right, like it was like a broad attempt on the left. I remember that also like the Caliphate groups Marx 21, for example, also made this a big campaign of their activism. And how do you judge this development now, right? Like where do you see the reason for not only, right, like as we see it, like a broader like electoral trend of like people migrating toward the AfD, but like specifically the people you were talking about, like former leftists. Yeah. Like what's the IL's or like your group in the IL's analysis of how did it come to this, and maybe also your own engagement with it? Like
it's a big question. I feel like you can answer it on many levels. Like first of all, like the theoretical level of what are like societal changes that made people like migrate in that way, but also like what are like the leftist failures of the past like 9 years since it's been 9 years since 2015, since the summer of migration. So like, and also can also talk about what the IL has done so far. I think I'm going to start on more of the like meta level and then move down. And it's going to be like a very shortened analysis of what EL thinks of it, and it's going to be only my point of view, so like excuse my shortcomings maybe. So basically what we are writing a new strategy paper at the moment. Because we feel like we need new answers. So all of this is coming from that strategy paper. If you're ever interested, I can let you know when it's out. Basically what we think the rise of people wanting to or leaning more into like a right-wing project like the AfD or like the Freie Wähler, which is also like a smaller like section of like right-wing parties in Germany, is for us that there's like two new models of the accumulation regime. So first of all, you've got the project of like more of like green capitalism in that way. I don't know if like for you guys it might be represented by Biden, for example, or like Hillary, maybe even close like what even like Bernie Sanders like fed into, if you take the Green New Deal on like more like a neoliberal term. And in Germany it's represented by the Ampel, which is a coalition of the neoliberals, the Green Party, and the Social Democratic Party, which is really not anymore. But and we see that basically because people are feeling left behind by this project of like green capitalism, where they are like only pushing forward like green capitalist ideas that really don't take into account that the like social part of all of this, that people actually, that we need a redistribution of the goods for actually making sure that the transition that we need in the face of climate change can be done. So basically, if you need like heating pumps in the houses and then the people have to pay for themselves, stuff like that, or that people who have been working in the coal mining industry for years and years and years, they need new jobs and they're not being supported to get new jobs, like stuff like that. So that's why we kind of feel like people are feeling left behind by these kind of by that government at the moment. They're really just like shortening, also like stuff like social, what's it called, Bürgergeld?
Social welfare.
Social welfare, yeah, they're shortening social welfare on so many levels. Like it's just this project of neoliberalism, which you can just see that it's just, not taking people with them or not taking it into account. And so that's why we think that people are being left behind by the so-called Ampel. And on the other hand, then you have more of like a right-wing project, which is, I don't know, for you guys probably Trump, and for us it's more represented by the AfD or people like Friedrich Merz, for example, where they've got like
who's the leader of the Christ Democratic Conservative Party in Germany.
Thank you. And so they're offering answers. They're like quite nationalist, or like more authoritarian in that way. They're like, okay, so if you vote for us, your jobs are secured, basically. Or also, like, we just touched on the topic of migration earlier, where they're trying to like externalize the problems in that way. So people are just looking for like easy answers in that way, and it's really, and that's actually a question of mine that I really have been, maybe you guys have answers to it, or maybe you have answers to it, but like how the how right-wing parties manage to cover up so well that their political programs are not made for the people that they vote for, or that vote for them, basically. How do they actually, the AfD doesn't, like, has a very neoliberal party program, and it's definitely not going to benefit like poor people or precarized people, but people still vote for them, and I really don't know why. Or like,
And do you have an explanation why leftists who before, I guess, at least in a certain way, identified at least not as nationalists, right? Like how they fell victim to this, or like do you think like they were nationalists before? Like why? Because right, like I understood you is like this explanation of the broader phenomenon of why the AfD is getting voters. I was more interested, like, do you have an idea of why former leftists feel like, oh no, these people somehow are more to be trusted with bringing about social change than my former comrades?
I think maybe if you also take a look at the split of the leftist party in Germany, like the leftist party just had a split of like one very major public person of them called Sarah Wagenknecht. She just formed a new party, or she's on the way, and actually she's like it's looking like a lot of people are actually going to vote for her, and like the leftist party is just going to disappear into nothingness basically, which is super scary for all of us. Or like people that are like whose money is, or their lives are dependent on money of the leftist party, or the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, for example. And I do believe that it actually does come down to the question of migration, that it's like an externalization of, okay, so it's actually the immigrants who are taking away from us. And it's actually like a lot of people who are already quite poor, who used to vote for the left, or who are now like, they really fell victim to this kind of like populist strategy that we as the left also never found like a coherent answer to. If you look back at the summer of migration, and like I feel like that's a very IL analysis, because we failed to do anything else but to support the government in the summer of migration. It just kind of like we never had proficient answers to this. So that's why I personally believe the migration question really like pushes people into becoming more nationalist on this kind of topic. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I found it very interesting to look at the history of the IL again, like especially when we relate it to like the governments in Germany, because like the IL was started, as I read it, in a process in 1999, and then finally like this, like the program of like the process of finding a program was finished in 2005, and 1999 was the year in which the red-green government entered into power, and 2005 was the year when they left government power. And then also, right, like the years of Occupy were years when the liberal or neoliberal party, the FDP, was in power in a coalition with the CDU, the Christ Democrats, right? Which was this high point, as you described. And I remember, right, this was also a time when there was this connection between like the Die Linke was like the precursor of Die Linke, which was just like an electoral alliance, was also founded in 2005. And I always had this impression, especially when I started with Platypus like 11 years ago, right, like in all of this of Occupy, which also translated in Germany into a longer campaign which was called Blockupy, and Blockupy seemed to be this project of connecting the opposition on the streets with this new oppositional party. And like in these years, I remember that at least many voices in the Interventionist Left were, for example, through the Institute for Solidaric Modernity, right? Like Institut Solidarische Moderne. They had the project of a red-green government, right? So Left Party, SPD, and Green Party. And I found it very interesting that now we have a similar, right? Like it's the second leftist government which you could have, so to speak. And
that's sad. That's really sad.
And it seems to me, right, like I also, of course, don't have answers, but like I would answer with another question. Like you said, like people who feel motivated to vote for the AfD, they are feeling left behind by the government, and how does the IL want to tackle that? Because for me it seems right like there is this one leg, which is like we need civil society organization, civil disobedience, but then there's also a rather open electoral strategy involved, right? Like that there is support, for example, for Die Linke in huge parts of the organization, as well as this is how it seemed to me that the last big campaign of Deutsche Wohnen and Co. enteignen, like expropriate big housing companies, basically. That this also seemed to be at least a certain support for the leftist parties being re-elected to the Berlin government. So would you say that there is a certain idea of pushing the government on certain points? Because that's how it appears to me. And like, do you think no, like how I understand the IL is that they think it's necessary. So why do you think it's necessary? Or would you disagree?
Why is it necessary to push the government and and also to address the government in many ways? Okay.
Which seems to be also right, like for what I took from you, a change, right? Like that there was support of the government under Merkel at this, like the summer of migration, as you termed it, summer 2015. And
I would say generally the left definitely, like not only the EA, but definitely the left supported, like same as COVID, for example. There was like huge governmental support.
Exactly. So and this seems to be something where you thought about. So could you tell us a bit more on this?
Well, I think it's kind of hard to tell because the EA is like we're quite non-dogmatic. So what I'm gonna say in the following is like mainly my opinion, and like we are also like we have a lot of internal discussions about should we support, for example, the Left Party or not. Like since the Left Party has split, there's been this movement of like it's called Us Now Together to the Leftist Party, and and like I think it's stupid to be honest, but or like not really stupid, but I don't think that's the way to go. Even if you actually look at how leftist parties in the past like 20 years, or how the movement to like get into these kind of parties as more like I don't know entryist kind of way has worked out. So like there is this movement of like thinking about should we support the Left Party or not, and I think on one hand it comes down to a question of like more like a materialistic kind of like they have the resources that we actually need to survive in a way as well. Like the left in Germany is dependent on the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and on many like funds that we need the Left Party for. So I feel like that's one part that you cannot ignore. Like so many people in the also like work in these kind of like NGOs, like supported things, and like so I think that's one part, and it's not a very glamorous part, to be honest, but I think it cannot be ignored. And second of all, I do feel like there was this movement of like, hey, so now we can go into the Left Party and actually push all the topics that are very important to the in that kind of way. So because I feel like our approach is to not focus on like the working class as like our revolutionary subject, but we try maybe in more of a like what's it called, like more in the tradition of like post-Marxist kind of way to like push forward like certain struggles at the front line. So basically to like work in like climate struggles, work as you said in like tenant struggles. So that's where we that's where we kind of thought, okay, maybe now is our time to actually move into the leftist party and do that. But that's a very small part of the EA. I think most of us just think it's a waste of resources. but we do still feel like it's important when we're talking about Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, for example. We do feel like if you work, if you kind of like shape your work according to like state lines, basically. For example, like expropriation or socialization. If you do that, we are trying to actually have materialistic wins, because we feel like so far we've only have like wins in terms of like the discourse. We might have like, you know, steered the discourse more in like a leftist manner in the past like 6 or 7, 8 years, from like through like Ende Gelände or something like that, but we haven't had any materialistic wins, and we kind of feel like if we do that, people might actually start, you know, the voters that we were talking about earlier, maybe they might see like, oh, hey, so leftist projects actually give me something in my day-to-day life. I have to pay less rent. That's great. Why is that? So that's why we kind of feel to like change like this hegemony that's like happening at the moment. We actually have to work within the system, and that's why we address the government as well, even though our long-term goal is something completely different. I feel like I only answered your question halfway, so maybe if you can.
But so, like, one thing that comes to mind now is that you're also, as it seems, have like a split perspective on the development over the last years, because on the one hand, you talked about, right, like the new right wing and the right wing success, but on the other hand, you also seem to evaluate that you changed the discourse to the left, so to speak. So do you have an idea of like, so like if we're saying properly postmodern, there is of course not a discourse, right? There are discourses. So,
definitely.
And this is also like, we don't have enough time, but like let me try to get some more points together.
Yeah.
Like, so I think this also came up, right? Like in the beginning that you're saying that you're an undogmatic organization, but there are also clearly like there's an emphasis, right? Like on, for example, anti-fascism, anti-sexism, abortion rights, environmentalism, of which, right, like especially in the later, the IL also wrote several topics, if I'm allowed to say so, over the last years, right? Like the first one, which I remember, was like Castor-Schottern, which was like the civil disobedience against the nuclear waste deposition in Germany. Then there was like the broader like struggle against coal mining, and then the support of broader climate strikes and whatever, right? So and like so you seem to be active in these different fields. And do you have like an idea, an assessment of where you might have been successful, where you might have not been successful, and what this means for the reevaluation of your past strategy and for how you want to strategize further?
Yes, for sure. Maybe I'll talk about our wins first, because, like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of us have felt quite disillusioned also in the past few years, as probably a lot of leftists have. So maybe I'll start with the good parts. What you said earlier, basically, we do believe that we did make a change in the discourse. Like, definitely, for sure. We managed, I think Ende Gelände at its highest point had like 7,000 people who were like willing to, you know, jump over fences and get into a coal mine, get like, not be scared of the cops and still have trust in us as an organization to actually get them home safely. And very few people actually have lawsuits because of that, which is, you know, a win is a win in that kind of sense. And so we do feel like we changed the discourse, but what we've been evaluating recently is that changing the discourse didn't do anything, or didn't really I don't know, make the left a more attractive project to most people, or like actually move beyond what we were actually trying to get at. We were not aiming to, I don't know, get the Greens into the government. We're not Fridays for Future, or we are not aiming to just shut down a coal mine. We're actually aiming for socialism long term. But that's somewhere where we want to get to, and we just see these struggles as like a way to get there. And we feel like the left has actually become more and more marginalized. So that's why we've been reevaluating a strategy. Because, for example, Ende Gelände has now what once felt really intense. Like my first Ende Gelände action was like crazy and just intense and like emancipatory and just really like awakened me of like as a political subject, or reawakened me. And so like I feel like that has happened to a lot of people, but now the civil disobedience is not radical enough anymore. Like people come there, they just know for sure, okay, I'm going to be taken care of in the coal mine, I'm going to be taken out, everything's organized. Some people even called it like a holiday vacation of leftist radicals. And, you know, that's...
activist-oriented holidays. That's
Yes.
how I got introduced to the concept. With by people who were like participating in the G8 summit protests, right? Like where they also like there the IL they organized buses and took people there. Yeah. It also reminded me, of course, what you were saying of Blockupy, right?
Yeah.
Like I have to say, like I needed to check like what year is this, because right, like I remember when like the cops had surrounded like the black bloc around Blockupy in 2013. It was exactly this, right? Like our win was that people had to piss their pants because they couldn't exit, right? Like the police isolation. And it was also like, for me, it seemed to be this idea of a certain like leftist unity perspective, left unity perspective or something like this. That's a way I was also emphasizing the at least cooperation with Die Linke, which I saw in Blockupy, right? Like there were like the Ums Ganze Alliance, the IL, and Die Linke all had speakers there. Of course, there were also, right, like other groups. It was not just this, but but to maybe then, right, like also bring it to another point which you mentioned, because like, I think now we got a good image like of the activism and also what's thrilling about this and how it can like energize people. Right? But you also spoke about like the knowledge you found in the IL, and you were speaking about you getting deeper into political theory, and you were also mentioning post-Marxism. So maybe can you tell us some more on like, are you reading theory? What kind of theory are you reading in the IL, or is there something which you think would be important to read? And to pile one last question on top of it, like where do you see like this relationship between this rather straightforward activism with a like how I judge it now broader political perspective, and these what seems to me at least for you very important theoretical questions?
I'll get to that in a second. I think there's one thing that I haven't really I felt like I haven't quite emphasized enough. So basically, I mean, you talked about the civil disobedience now, but I do feel like a big part of the IL is organizing, and like especially like transformative organizing, as like Deutsche Wohnen eignen, like expropriation of like big housing companies, and that's like a struggle that the IL has been part of for like over 10 years, and who has gotten like the majority of the vote in Berlin, like as the referendum happened. So like that's also really, really big part of the IL, and I also do feel like it shows the debate that is happening within us now, and that has been happening for quite a while. We call it I'm wondering if there's like political theory behind that, but for us it's more like the debate of like minority versus majority. So because we do believe that like mainly acting from the marginalized left, should we actually just stay there and just do even more radical actions, especially like climate activism has evolved so much in Germany in the past like 2 or 3 years, because the last generation people like their actions have become more and more radical, and we feel like we're not radical enough anymore. And some people are like, actually, you know what we should be a risk factor for companies to invest in like in things like coal power plants and stuff like that. There are people who believe in that, and then on the other hand, maybe you have Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, the housing campaign, and there are more people who are, what you were talking about, who think we should form broad alliances. We should actually get the majority of people on our side, and to maybe actually relate this to something more like theoretical. The people who are more like into the minority fraction, those who are closest to like critical theory, who are like saying, okay, the majority of the people don't really care. It's like more of a like regressive authoritarian like mindset. We can't change that. We actually need to make materialistic damage. And then you have the people on the other hand who believe we should form majorities, who are more in like a post-Marxist tradition. So like that's maybe, I don't know if that helps, but to like give this like a background of theory. And now I'm just continuing on to the question that you were asking earlier. What kind of theory do we read, and what's our relationship with that? I think what you could mainly say is that the IL is like bound together by like a very loose Marxist analysis. As I said, we're non-dogmatic, so people find that a lot like in that on these terms, and I do feel like the things I refer most to is more like Gramsci, we're not on his like Stalinist point of views, but more of the like crisis of hegemony and everything that came after that. So I think we're having like a Gramsci Negri debate, and also especially maybe the IL maybe more like 9 years ago or something was more in the tradition of like Chantal Mouffe or Electoral, in the terms of like, okay, we should actually form broad alliances, and also it's very important for us to actually be at the forefront of these struggles, and to not, as I said earlier, have like one subject like the working class, but also to like just focus on the social struggles at hand. And I feel like you can really see that. We do have reading circles and stuff like that. We do have weekend seminars, because of the recently because of the fascist. I'm just gonna call it danger. Threat. Thank you. I was like Bedrohung. What is Bedrohung? Because of the fascist threat, we are going to read Marx' essay on Brumaire on the 18th of you guys know. I have
18th Brumaire.
Yes. Yes, and I haven't read it yet. I'm about to read it. You guys probably have all read it.
Every year.
So, I do feel like that is... So we do that, and we try... We look into theory for like answers for our practice, but I don't really feel like... I kind of... Like, we wish to have like a more dialectic relationship between theory and practice, but I feel like all leftists do that, or most leftists, and I feel like we fail. I feel like we mainly like do practice and then look back into theory if we fail, and then it's more like it's a bit more like that. And it's also, I do feel like, depends on how old the people are as well. I do feel like, and I don't know why that is actually, the older generation is more schooled in like critical theory, I would say. Maybe that's also because in the 90s in Germany you had the big like anti-imperialist versus like anti-Deutsch debate.
They're called the anti-Deutsch in English as well.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, it's
you
a
can
very
also say
German.
anti-German, but like it's the anti-Deutsch.
It's a very German like phenomenon
Yeah.
as well. So like yeah. So I do feel like there's more people being schooled and like this kind of like critical theory. Yeah.
Maybe like raise one more point before we open it to the audience, because I found this interesting, right? As far again as I know, is that at least parts of like the early like the people who early on founded the Interventionist Left came on the spectrum of the very early anti-Deutsch, right? That there was also a split, and as far as I figured it out, is that of an initial group whose name I forgot now, is that some people went on through some like some sideways. Then the one wing founded the Interventionist Left, and the others like Ganze Top Berlin. The Interventionist Left seemed to be a bit more on the, you know, like social justice scale, so to speak, right? Like more also a certain like idea of from below, while there on the Top Berlin and Ganze was a bit more about like may be real or suited by a certain radicalism, not only in the actions they did, but also in theory. And they like, right, they erased this anti-national perspective, and to me seems like looking back that that Ganze, Top Berlin, was a bit more on the like soft anti-Deutsch part, so to speak, in their anti-nationalism, why the IL also appears anti-nationalist. But with a more of, you know, like even like some hints of like post-colonialism, or as you brought it up, right, like left populism. And so I felt like, I know there was a split from the IL some years ago, right, like rather recently, I think like 2 years ago, right? And
definitely.
I think it was in the wake of Corona, and so like, do you think like this shaped conflicts which are happening right now, and are you seeing conflicts in I'm sorry that we have to talk it, but I found it like interesting in a certain kind of way, like are you having conflicts in your organization around Israel-Palestine after October 7th? I'm sorry.
I was like, I'm just praying to the Lords.
I mean, you're right. Like, I don't want to stir the pot on this. Like,
no,
more interested.
I think it's really important that we talk about this. It's all good. It's just more like I'm sitting here as like an individual of the EL, and I'm really not representing what the entirety of the EL thinks. Like, we have like 30 local groups, and I feel like each has got their own stance on Israel-Palestine. So like,
makes sense.
Firstly, about one thing about like the split that happened back then. I don't really know too much about like Top Berlin or Ganze, because in Leipzig they're really not present, or like are they kind of like or they stopped doing at least like political work in Leipzig a few years ago. But back then, when I actually thought about which political group to go to, I was like, I can't go to Ganze because they're only reading theory. That was my perception of that, and like back then I was like, nah, actually I want to do practice. And I also do feel like as a cliche thing that people are really into like critical theory, like only do, it makes sense in that way, but like only do theory instead of practice. And so I would say that your assumption is right, of like saying, okay, the people are more pushing for like social justice struggles or post-colonial theory or studies are more part of the EA. But nonetheless, I feel like there's different like schools of theory inside of the EA, and one thing that I do have to say is that the EA is still quite a very white group. It's a very white organization, and so the discussions that we do have, especially about like post-colonialism, are also shaped quite strongly by first of like, how do we deal with like critical whiteness in that way? Because we don't want to be allies, we want to be comrades, but how? And that's also because we have a lot of like the BIPOC people in our organization are really pushing that they're like, okay, you gotta read Bafta Sabo, you have to really get into like materialist anti-racism, and so that's why I think like post-colonial studies are like really like something that we're like that some people are really, really deep into, and other people are just kind of like, oh, I'm scared, what do I do with that? So yeah, I think it's one part. Israel-Palestine, sorry, maybe I got just off the tray for a second. Israel-Palestine is being discussed quite widely in our groups, and we do have very, I wouldn't say, so far nobody that I know of has left the EA because of that, and I do feel like the non-dogmatic in the name kind of allows for that, but nonetheless, I am part of, or the group in Leipzig has not made a statement on the war in any way yet. And I'm actually one of the few people trying to push the discussions in our group because of that, because I don't feel in the political landscape of nowadays where we want to be like active in different struggles, you cannot, in my opinion, you have to have an opinion on Israel-Palestine, and like it should be layered, of course, but like if you want to be politically active, especially in Leipzig, you cannot avoid it. The EA Berlin, for example, has done a statement on like what I would say just very like easy stance for them in like their like pro ceasefire. They're still making very sure to mention in every statement the Hamas and criticize the right-wing government of Israel. So they're trying to do like a, it's a slippery, the tightrope basically. And in Frankfurt, the Frankfurt has done the same. We haven't managed so far at Leipzig because. I think also because we come from a quite anti-Deutsch tradition. And also, yeah, because we kind of felt like we've reconstituted ourselves as a group quite recently in a way. Like there's been a lot of changes. There's a lot of like very like new and young people that came into the air, and we just kind of felt like we don't have a great like a fully formed opinion on that. So at the moment we're just reading. We're like discussing about the different definitions of anti-Semitism. We're reading, what have we been reading recently? Sabanochimi, for example, and what are the anti-Deutsche that we've been reading? I'm trying a lot of bell tower articles. Sorry, I can't really, but like we've been trying to like educate ourselves recently. We've had discussions about the apartheid state, stuff like that. But like that's basically what we're trying to do at the moment, and we're still not there yet, sadly.
All right.
But maybe you don't have to be.
Yeah.
But no.
Thank you so far. We're opening it up. I see a first hand raised. It's a lot. And like, let me do like some order. Like Andreas, so we'll have each question like single. Like Andreas, Thomas, and Henry were the first hands as well. Try to keep it a bit brief because we have like a little over half an hour left. Yeah. I'm sorry for making it so long.
Yeah, sorry for talking so much.
No.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your remarks. I found it to be very interesting. One question that your remarks raised for me is the question of history. How did you, the EL, view history? What sort of, do you have any concern with an historical account of yourself as an organization, but as well as of the present, and its opportunities or failures or successes? And more specifically, do you have any historical, let's say, moments you refer to, when it comes to where your practices come from, where your tradition, so to speak, came from, and tied to that. So that's the first question. And tied to that is, when you mentioned that, I found an interesting combination between Occupy on the one hand and then the migration crisis, which are, of course, related in a way that Occupy like happened together with the Arab Spring, which is one of the main reasons for the migration wave and the civil wars that produced that. And it's also, I think, a major turning point within the history of neoliberalism. So based on that, do you think that neoliberalism is gone now? Do you think it's in crisis? Do you think we still live in neoliberalism? So that's two questions, history and the present.
Yeah, big questions. Regarding your first question, I've actually thought about this a lot because of the panel on Saturday, and also just like trying to relate to Platypus in that way, because I feel like you guys are so focused on history in that way, and I think it's very fruitful. I think it makes a lot of sense. And then I tried to relate to, okay, so how do we regard like leftist history? And I also asked like my comrades and stuff like that, and I was like, okay, wow. So I think, first of all, we relate to like history that was like 150 years ago, like for the first or the second international, like stuff like that, or like even longer than that. I'm sorry.
Or the 18th Brumaire, right?
Yeah, it's like I feel like we relate to that mainly through theory or through reading. We don't really in our reading circle, like we do try to see what can we learn from that, but it's not like we rarely talk about it. Like we choose like certain moments, but like that long ago doesn't really we don't really reflect on that. And I actually personally think that is something that we could do way more, because I feel like there's a lot to learn. And then I asked my my comrades, basically, I was like, hey, so what about the new left? Because we seem to be a child of them, or like also you guys also relate us to them in terms of like, hey, so like fighting for climate change, anti-racist struggles, trying to like entwine all of them. I do feel like we also don't talk about that, but I do think it's present in the way that we are trying to reject what happened in the new left in the terms of like not regarding like the materialistic side of things. So when we talk about like identity politics, for example, like I do feel like it's very like it's quite present in our practice, but there's always something that we were like, okay, but what is actually, how can we move past that? How can we actually take into account the economic part of things? So I do think there's a mirror, but it's never like, oh, but you remember 68? Like, you know, like we shouldn't do that. Like it doesn't really, that's never happened. But a quite recent mirror, I'd say for us, or also the reason why the EL was founded was like the heritage of the autonomous movement and like the late 80s and 90s. Because that is exactly what we were trying to avoid, and actually we've recently realized like, oh damn, we're still quite deep into that. So like what we criticized back then, that there was no like coherent organization in the autonomous like circles. We also felt like we're also really against like insurrectionalist like tendencies. We don't just want to, you know, fuck things up just for the matter of fucking up, or for like, you know, waking people up in their day-to-day life or stuff like that. We don't do that, and that's where we reflect on. That's also a reason why the EL was formed back then, because we saw the failure of one of the summits. I actually don't remember which one it was. Like I think one of like, yeah, it was one in Cologne where the autonomous movement just failed majorly, and that's why the EL was like, okay, we need to talk, and we also need movements that are not just like sectarianism, like little autonomous groups who never really talk to each other. We actually need a broader connection between everything. So I do feel like we mirror ourselves on the history on the left only on the most recent events. I would say the past like 20 years or something. So 30, yeah. Your second question on neoliberalism, we think that neoliberalism is in crisis. Definitely. That's like, I think also like the analysis of our strategy, the strategy paper that we're writing at the moment, we do think that the societal like symptoms, like the crises as well that are happening are just like the reason because capitalism is just failing in many of its mechanisms, like and I've never heard anyone talking about like is neoliberalism over. I would actually really like Platypus lecture on that if you would like to get into that. I'd be very interested in it. That's a very like short answer, but yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I also had a question about, since you brought up the crisis of neoliberalism now, one way we could think of what sort of intervention you're making. At least how I understood it, it was an intervention into society. And if we think of capitalism as a social crisis, then, right, politics becomes about leadership of society in a certain way. And your starting point was Occupy, which in many respects was an interesting way for an intervention to be made, because there seemed to be a popular movement that sort of recognized capital as a problem in some sort of way. It was very unclear how that should be handled, and of course there's plenty of criticisms to be made about Occupy, but there seemed to be an opportunity there for the left to talk about capital as such. And I'm wondering if the same conditions apply now, considering the sort of social movements that we see today seem much more fractured and actually sort of related to capital. Obviously there's this idea of green politics, but you mentioned a disappointment with green capitalism. There's the migration crisis, which of course includes labor, citizenship, this sort of stuff. But in a way, it's not secondary, but maybe oblique or somehow less related. And I just wanted to ask if you think the same sort of intervention could be made today, or what are the possibilities for leftist sort of intervention into civil society today?
Regarding capital in that kind of way?
Yeah, or perhaps, I mean, one way to maybe put it more directly would be, does the same sort of critique of capitalism exist today? Does the possibility of such a critique exist today? And perhaps the EL's role within that? Because of course you mentioned that you guys have had an influence, you've shifted the language, we hear this sort of, thought. And right, are we actually at a higher stage now or a lower stage than was possible in Occupy?
Great question. I think I have two answers to that. One of like, I'm going to dive into our practice. I think one of them is past projects that we've done, especially since the COVID crisis, and also what we're aiming to do in that way. So basically, we have found, especially in the last 2 years, with like inflation and really the cost of everything just rising. We have actually really tried for campaigns in that way. Like, for example, in the UK, you had the We Don't Pay campaign. Do you guys know what I'm seeing? Like, general people who are nodding. People who were like against paying like higher, or who were like, okay, we're not paying the higher like energy prices. So like also like really related to the war between like Russia and the Ukraine, basically. And we thought, and probably like if you're from Germany, you might also like be quite familiar with this. We thought it was gonna be a hot autumn, basically. It really wasn't. It was really, really disappointing in that sense. Like, we tried many campaigns that just really aimed at just like the economic status of the people. Like we went for We Don't Pay. We tried it in different cities as well. In Hamburg, it actually went quite okay. In Leipzig, it didn't really pay off at all. And we just kind of felt like, or my perspective on that is that we didn't managed to address people in the right way, or that was not relatable what we're trying to do, which is really a shortcoming, because what the EL is trying to do is to be a bridge between like society and like leftist radicalism, and we just failed at that. Maybe, I don't know if it's not relatable or if the right just has like easier answers in that way, but because I do feel like the right actually manages to make that have better answers, but like when it comes to like capital, or just like and so we tried the We Don't Pay campaign. We what else did we try? Let me just think of it. We also tried to form, like, at least in Leipzig, like citywide alliances where people were just like standing in front of supermarkets, handing out flyers, and be like, hey, let's get together on the street against like the rising energy prices and stuff like that. And it just simmered, or like nothing really came of it. So to be honest, we kind of found that it's way better to address it in tenant struggles, for example, and because there people are like directly affected. It's still about like the materialistic conditions of you living in a house that where your rent is just like constantly rising, and but like the connection is way stronger. So we found that actually was Hebel. Lever. That was or levy. Lever. Thank you. That was a lever that actually works if you address people through that. And that's a new strategy that we're trying out at the moment. The topic of, we call it socialization, but I do feel like socialization in Platypus terms of view, or language, is more like the socialization, like your process into society. And we're talking about like redistribution of goods. So is that both? Can I just use socialization? Cool. And that is like a campaign that we just did a conference on where to implement socialization as a redistribution of goods in agriculture, in living conditions, or like just tenants' struggles, in hospital work, or more like working in like hospitals and stuff like that, and so care. That's what I'm looking for, care. And like energy wise, so what could it look like if we address like energy companies, and what if it looked like if we expropriated them? And we're hoping that this is a way to actually connect these kind of like to actually like bring back like the more like economic question back to the table, if we connect it to something that people are like also directly affected by, but that just seems to work better. Does that answer your question?
First Henry, and then second round.
Yeah, okay, so you mentioned that you are reconsidering right now your relationship to Die Linke, and maybe even to a potential red-green government. Mm-hmm. And there's, as you probably are aware of, not only in the L but outside of it, many people that think about entering Die Linke, and there's calls for doing so.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you would consider that as a major strategic break with what the EL once used to be about. Mm-hmm. And what I'm specifically having in mind here is, of course, the extra parliamentary position that the EL used to be famous for. Mm-hmm. So there's two things that I want to raise. There's a 2014 interim report by the EL and an article that's called "Why is Our Opposition Extra Parliamentary?" Right? Yeah. And basically what is being said there is that your understanding of the EL is that it has to be fundamentally antagonistic to the state.
Yes.
That it can at no point become part of the bourgeois state apparatus. Mm-hmm. That you have no aspirations to get mandates or anything like that. Mm-hmm. That the goal should be the creation of a social counterpower, that is beyond and across state institutions, as the formulation goes, rather than tailing left liberal governments or parties or capitalist politics in general.
Yeah.
And in the 2017 article, the question is also raised, that some people might think, oh, if we had a red-green government during the Greek crisis, maybe that would have been the better way than having CDU and Schäuble. But then the article goes on to argue, no, this is an illusion. It might actually be the case that, having a red-green government, or even like Die Linke is part of that, that's maybe important to note here for those that don't know, would be part of that. That could actually be counterproductive and a greater danger for the left, because it might end up in disappointment and in the credibility and possibility of left-wing opposition to the state. So with all of that in mind, I think the things that you raised now, your reconsideration of the relationship to the party Die Linke, and maybe parts of the things that were raised in these questions, I'm asking myself, do you consider this as a major strategic break? If so, why do you think that break was necessary? Like, what has happened in the subsequent history that made it necessary? The 2017 article, for example, does raise the AfD, and but then still goes on to say, okay, this is not sufficient to argue for supporting these governments or these parties. How do you understand that in the subsequent time things have changed with respect to these reconsiderations?
Yes. Well, I think I'm still quite, I'm maybe the wrong person to ask, because I'm very much for that 2017 article that you just mentioned. Like, for me, especially I don't know, maybe in the US context, it makes more sense to think of the failures of the DSA, for example, and if you regard Podemos, if you regard Syriza, in my opinion, there's no way that that we actually that a leftist party will make the changes that it actually needs for in the strive for socialism. So I don't consider being part of the left, but I do think that, and I'm also not deep into these discussions, so there might be way more pros to this than I know of, but what I would judge it is as more firework politics, or we call it firework politics. We're just trying to just stop the dangers from happening, and especially coming from an East German political group, it's where it's quite plausible for a few people to be part or trying to strengthen the left. Why is that? Because we believe it's very, some people believe it's very important to strengthen the left right now, because the right is so omnipresent that there's no way that that a leftist party like that can die, and that it actually needs a leftist party in the government, because when the AfD is going to be voted for, there's going to be so many changes. In this year, there's 2 elections where I live. There's communal elections and there's county elections. And if the AfD actually has strong positions in both of these, it means that our kind of activism and the dangers that we're going to actually meet on the street is just way bigger. So that's why I do feel like it's more of a means to an end. In that way, people actually become part of the left party to strengthen that party, to get more people who are not voting for the left, but who are voting for the Greens at the moment, or voting for, I don't know, some other even smaller leftist party, to actually get them back into the left, to actually strengthen that. But it's really not the goal of it's not the big goal. It's not really as us being extra parliamentary and essentially antagonist to the left. That's what we're aiming for, but it's the short-term answer at the moment that some of us believe is necessary to fight right-wing tendencies. I would say that there's that, and there's also a window of opportunity that some people saw when the leftist party split up. I do believe it's a strategic break. And I cannot stand for it. Like I'm trying to find arguments in my head, but for me it just like doesn't make sense. So yeah.
All right, so let's have another triplet of questions. Like I would take the non-Germans. Like again, 3 questions. Oh, like then it's like Ephraim, Tom, and Danny. If we have some time after that, like let's do it. But all right, Ephraim.
Okay, thank you very much for the very, very interesting discussion. I think one problem is that it is too limited to Germany at the moment. So I'd like to ask about the EU.
Yeah.
Because it seems that the EU is the issue looming behind Occupy, Greek crisis, migrant crisis, and also the AfD. My understanding is that while there's kind of Euroscepticism within the AfD, they've actually backed away from being oppositional to the EU. And that's similar to Giorgia Meloni in Italy and the Front National have kind of actually backed away from a certain kind of critique of the EU. Obviously in England, where I'm from, we had Brexit. And you know, the first Platypus conference I ever went to was in Frankfurt in 2015. And there we had many discussions about the crisis of the EU. And it was very much in the context of Podemos and Syriza and Fortress Europe. And while there were debates about whether one wanted to break up the EU or transform it into a social Europe, it was clear that left was opposed to the EU. And I don't think anyone could even imagine that 1 year later the Brexit vote would happen, and that the right, quote unquote, would be leading this anti-EU sentiment, which wasn't just about like the left behind, right, which we also have in England, but democracy, and the question of the state. So my question is, how do you think about the EU? Has that changed over this kind of past 10 years, past 15 years that we've been narrating? And do you mentioned trying to copy the Don't Pay campaign from the UK, which also turned out to be nothing very quickly in England. Do you relate to other parts of the left in Europe, and how do you imagine the issue of achieving socialism beyond Germany? Or is it just that there will be socialization of the German state?
I think about the expropriation topic, we're very aware that it's quite a very nation-focused thing, and that is something that we struggle with internally as well. About the EU, since to be honest, my analysis of what happened back in 2015 and 2016 is quite is not very deep. So, but what I can say of the IL politics back then, or what you mentioned about that people back then were like, okay, maybe we should oppose, or they did oppose Europe, as you just said, and but when Brexit happened, that was not the thing that they were aiming for, and I feel like the reason back then, from what I've read in old EL articles, was hey, we need a more just relationship with each other in the EU, or we need to have more of a leftist approach to that. And I feel the values that were pushed through in Brexit, to me personally, didn't really seemed more on liberal orientated. It seemed more liberal orientated, more in the terms of freedom and stuff like that. And I do feel the IL at the moment is actually trying to regain or to reconnect on a European level, because we do recognize the struggle from back then, or the fight that we lost with the Commune of Europe. What was it? I think it was Europe Commune. There was like this movement back then that were like tried to connect leftist movements back then, or also the transnational social strike, where the IL back then was part of, but they never really gave much thought into it. Now that it's like it's actually gaining momentum, because we do believe that, like, for example, the transnational social strike could be a means to reconnect leftist movements throughout Europe. And
Sorry, what is the transnational social strike?
it's a movement of like leftist groups and organizations all throughout Europe who are trying to connect. I think on one hand on different topics. For example, like there's one called Climate and Class. The other one's on migration, and the third one I actually forgot, I'm really sorry. And they're trying to connect on these struggles and trying to see what can we learn from each other and where can we actually work together. And that actually was built up in 2015 or 2016. And now it's being, reactivated. And we've really been invited by the people there to actually join. And people were like, so the hasn't really been doing any like European kind of work. What's going on with that? So there's a bit of like criticism in that manner, and also on like international level. I'm trying to shorten it. We have been working together with Soulèvement de la Terre. Do you know them? It's this like French activist group who are working for fighting for land and water justice. We're inviting each other, and we're trying to go to each other's action, and we're trying to form like a common strategy, but it's really, really hard. And I feel like more on the climate level there's connection. Also, like Ende Gelände has always had like Czech relations, and also we've been inviting activists from like the global south, as in like Peru and Colombia, and or places where like gas and coal mining is also happening, and those are like the connections that we're trying to make so far.
By the way, I've also heard that we can go a bit longer, so it will be now Tom, then Danny, then Henning, then Justin, and then Ed, and then we'll have to wrap up. So that we're out in about half an hour, I think that should work, right? So please go ahead, Tom.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the question of post-Marxism.
Yeah.
One obvious question is whether that's a label that all the members of the Interventionist Left would be kind of comfortable with, or if that's a kind of interpretation just in this room today.
Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, would be that the idea of post-Marxism is now like has a sort of long history, like it's a 60-year tradition in a way, and you also talked about trying to get beyond the new left and a sort of return to materialism, a return to economics, which would imply a sort of post-Marxism, and yet in that, it's funny that you are going back to the 18th Brumaire. You are preparing to read Marx.
Yeah.
So I just and that's to do with anti-fascism. So the real, I know there's 3 questions packed into this, but there's the third question. The real question would be, what about post-Marxism is proved sort of insufficient that in the face of fascism, the moment requires a return to Marx, actually, and specifically a reading of the 18th Brumaire.
Yeah. I think so. Basically, I'm not sure if the entirety of the IL would actually agree that we're like post-Marxists. I do feel like, I don't know, like Antonio Negri and Chantal Mouffe, like people that we do refer to. And so like when I talk to my comrades about this, I was like, which kind of theories do we use? Like where does it pop up? Like can we just like gather that so it's not only my point of view? So like not sure of the entire, I think that's the non-dogmatic label that allows for that, but sometimes feel like it's a shortcoming. Because our strategy paper has taken us like 3 years to write now, and I do feel like lacking theory actually shows up into like the struggles that we have with that. So if we focus on the part of going, like meeting people where they're at in their social struggles, that's I think it's Move who was actually emphasizing that. I do feel that in the IL we've been noticing like the classic criticism that there's always, like, you know, that like the struggles are not related, that we do struggle to move beyond that, especially like if you think about like eco-activism. All we kind of felt like we did was just like buying into or like pushing the Green Party into the government, like stuff like that, if you don't actually have a profile. And we do actually feel like what we've been talking in Leipzig about a lot is that we need a new class politics of the 21st century, and we don't know how to address people in that, because we kind of feel like we're very good at meeting people where they're at, but since we're like missing the main, like, since we're not the communist group who walks around like red shirts and red everything, you know what they look like. We feel like we're lacking in our own profile in that way. People don't really connect us with like socialism, even though we feel that it's like very like central to us. So that's maybe also why we feel like, okay, we need to go back and see what these people did right, or what Marx did, or maybe especially the Second Internationalists did right, to like address people and like very, very different parts of society in that way. So we're trying to move past like more the, I would say, neoliberal remnants of the new left, and to like find a way back, but it's tough.
Thank you very much for the remarks and everything. I had a question about, I think you were talking about these two regimes of accumulation. This was like a theory.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about politically how that's expressed in society. I may be more familiar, obviously, with the American version of this than the German one. But they tend to kind of manifest as like, vote for us or you will die kind of policies, meaning either vote for us because we will put through the green reforms or we'll all be killed by a biblical flood, or the other version, which is the other accumulation theory, is vote for us or you will be replaced, right? There's like the replacement theory. And I bring that up because if I heard correctly, I think you said that what you guys have been trying to do is give a theory of how to kind of split the circle, like do the reforms, but also you're not going to be replaced. And to me, I guess that kind of sounds like, it kind of sounds like progressive capitalism. Meaning if I was to, I was going to say bring Joe Biden in here, but let's say Joe Biden's administration, like the kind of people who would think about this, they would love to hear, how do we get these reforms through without creating a labor crisis or creating all sorts of resentment that could hit us at the polls, right? And so I guess my question, and I think this is at the end of your remarks, you just said this right now, why do you feel that one has to be a socialist? And also, how do you relay that in practice? Meaning, why isn't one just simply giving a better policy there and even solving this problem that the capitalists themselves would be very interested in hearing?
I'm hoping I can, I think it's very, valid criticism in that way. I do believe that maybe it lies more in our approach than in our practice. I do feel like there's a huge difference in that. So, in saying, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second. Basically, because we criticize the state as a whole in that way, because we're basically saying that, the power politics that are at play, we don't believe that the party system as it exists right now will ever make way for a future that benefits all, and the so-called good life for all, even though that's more of like maybe like degrowth communism kind of like framing, but like so basically that's what we're aiming for, and that's what we're trying to transform. And I do feel like that's always a problem with these, what I called earlier, like the majority politics. So like I don't think that you can ignore that you can pull people on the side of your politics if you have something to offer to them. So if you have jobs to offer to them, like of course, like, but to actually, and I think that's the art in that, to actually have something to offer on a materialistic basis, but also to install like a crisis of the hegemony in that way that maybe happened in Occupy like a while ago, but to like, you know, break the system of people believing that they need parties for that, or that they need capitalism for that, and like that there's no alternative to capitalism. That's what we're trying to, that's why also we're trying to offer different ideas, and that's why we also believe that you need socialism as like, hey, so here's a different way that this could work. We also have, you know, maybe something else to offer you, but maybe you're right, maybe that's also just progressive, capitalism, maybe it's just us trying to be a better party or something. But that's why we're still always trying to be antagonistic to the state in general, and that's why we're also, and I kind of feel like you also see that in like transformative organizing, for example, or that's what I would maybe that's an example where you can differentiate in like community organizing, where you're just trying to have better things for your neighborhood, and transformative organizing actually questioning why is our neighborhood built the way it is, why does it need these changes. So yeah, does that answer your question a bit?
Yeah.
Talking about offering socialism as a better alternative, maybe, I want to ask you, so you said that the IL aims to be the forefront of socialist struggles, and I ask myself, how does this fit to your anti-fascism? So how do you address these struggles which led the broader mass vote for right-wing parties, like the AfD? Or is this intervention the core of your anti-fascism, to like show solidarity with the people, the people's rage against the establishment, instead of entitle them as Nazis just because they got attracted to the AfD or other right-wing parties over the years? So my question is, how do you convey both sides of fighting the right side, and organizing the people who tend to the right?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? So you're basically saying that, just for me to reframe, as in like, how do you talk to people who are like maybe already voting for the AfD and not telling them like, oh, you're a Nazi, just get the fuck away, basically? And what's the other position?
And how do you address their struggle? Talking about finding a new class policy. You mentioned. Yeah.
Which, if I may interject, seems to also go back on this point which you raised several times about like the majority and the minority. Yeah. Right? Like this seems to be this comes into conflict, or like this interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I do feel like in our anti-fascist politics, especially in the east of Germany, it's, as I said, mainly firework politics. So
fire department politics.
Yeah, so not firework, fire department. Thank you.
Now
That makes sense. Huge change.
Figured it out together.
So basically, I think it really depends on where the L group is at, that you like, and how how the right is positioned there. So, like, for example, if you're talking about like more like rural parts, our anti-fascist strategy is to get people to vote for the for the Christian Democratic Party, basically. Because in some rural areas you have to do that, and that's where we're just like, okay, here we're just like part of the party system. We're not actually, advancing any like social improvements for anyone. We're just trying to not have a right-wing government. So that sometimes for some people is, when they're in a more rural area, that's their anti-fascist politics, and it sucks. And that's where you kind of have to be part of this like majority of the city that you're living in, or more the town or the village in that way. So, if I may refer to someone outside of the EL for a second, a person who's the editor of Jacobin magazine, Ines Schwertner in Germany, she recently said, Antifa is welfare state. And I was kind of like, first I was like, no, I don't get that. That's really not what Antifa is about. Antifa is about like fighting Nazis, and I was really upset, and I was just like, okay, so Antifa is everything. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and also came to the conclusion that she might be right in like various ways. So that's why we have. In Leipzig, we have an AG called just Social Struggles, where we're actually trying to, just really doing like state-affirming things, like, fighting for less rent, or we've recently been part of a campaign at our airport, I have a different example of we've been for years been part of the Amazon anti-Amazon campaign, basically, and where we're also just like trying to fight for very like low level improvement in people's lives, because we feel that's more like prevention than actual like fighting it. But it's nothing revolutionary in that sense. It's just really just being like, hey, can we just limit the destruction. Yeah.
Can I ask a real quick follow-up?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so considering that you basically, to my question earlier, said that you do consider that what the EL has done in the past years is a major strategic break.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you relate to the split that was mentioned earlier from, some people that split from the EL, whose criticism, that's at least my understanding, is that the EL, which was supposed to be a critical, quote-unquote, intervention into society and politics, ceased to be critical enough, and kind of appears to be, at least, somewhat indistinguishable from establishment politics when it comes to issues like Ukraine, COVID, and others. Maybe AfD, I think the AfD was also brought up in that discussion. I'm not sure if I could recall that correctly. Maybe you can say something about this split, and do you think the criticism is fair, especially having in mind that you said, I think there is a major strategic break, and that you kind of disagree with it.
Yeah. To be honest, about the split, I felt like a lot of criticism that was being voiced is valid. People were saying that, as you just said, like just for context, the EL has just become like, I don't know, sometimes just like to like prime people for working in an NGO to be more efficient, to be more group orientated in that kind of way, and to be honest, I felt like the shortcomings that they were like voicing about the EL in that time, I was like, but those are the shortcomings of the left in general, and I really didn't understand that. I was just like, hey, so which other leftist group has actually succeeded? At least maybe in Germany, like you're very right, I do have a very German-focused perspective, but I do feel like there's very few groups in Germany I don't know any who've actually found a sufficient response to the COVID crisis that is not state-affirming. You were looking at me in a very...
No, I was just wondering what their perspective is.
No, I said that there's like you had the like zero COVID campaign, stuff like that, and actually there's basically, I was just saying very few because I didn't want to say none, but actually you're right, maybe it's just none. So I was just kind of like, hey guys, so that's just the left failing at the moment and just like fighting against past failures of themselves and against like political like disadvantages or societal disadvantages. It's like just fighting against. So I was just kind of like, I don't get it. And I do think what we took into account from that split back then was that we actually need to refocus on being more radical. And I definitely agree on that point with you. And to just dive into like EL politics, what we've been doing so far is just trying to like, tie together alliances. We were often the ones like moderating the plenaries, or just, organizing the buses and stuff like that. And by just trying to get people together, we lost our own profile. And we kind of shied away from voicing like radical points of views, and now we're trying to actually remind ourselves like, hey, just for getting people together does not mean we need to abandon a radical stance. So in our new strategy paper, we're writing about wanting to emphasize that again, and how that's going to be, I actually have no clue yet. But yeah, I would agree with the point.
Thank you.
All right, we already get, I'm sorry, the two last question, which is Justin and Ed. If we still have some time left, I'll take you up, Brian. Please, Justin.
Hi, yeah. So earlier on in your talk, which was great, by the way, you mentioned two different models of accumulation regimes. So on the one hand, you have the sort of green capitalism, like the recently instituted neoliberal policies that are designed to cut down on...
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you mentioned like green capitalism, the sort of neoliberal policies designed to cut down on like energy consumption and stuff being like followed through, implemented by the state.
Yeah.
And then you have this sort of discontent with that and the fear of people being rendered replaceable by the automation or the sort of supersession of fuel coal industries.
Yeah.
But I feel like, I don't know if your experience is different. I feel like around 2015, 2016, and shortly after, during that sort of electoral upswing on the left, I'd see a lot of like think pieces arguing how green capitalism is like a contradiction in terms. Like you can't have necessarily like eco-friendly capitalism, and that a revolution is necessary in order to affect like, a solution to climate change. But I feel like now there's more, I don't know if I want to say realism, but people are more likely to accept that maybe capitalism can handle the climate crisis in some way, even if it only reconstitutes problems, on a deeper level.
So you're saying can or can't?
Can. Maybe it can, like in its own kind of fucked up kind of way.
Yeah.
So in general, I'm just sort of noticing a trend in what you were saying about a lot of these sort of nominally left-wing policies that ultimately end up getting pushed through by right-wing parties and by the right, especially like with regard to redistribution of like economic resources, and how the right is often in some ways tending to the immediate economic interests of people, albeit in a different way than like people sort of accustomed to the left would expect. So with that in mind, I kind of just wanted to ask, like, because with the electoral crisis, we kind of pushed through like all this policy stuff about climate change and fixing it and all that, and now we have it and we got it right. So now it's being implemented, and not necessarily like in a complete or fulfilled way, but it feels like the right is actually picking up these changes that the left was originally trying to push. So what can the left offer society that the right can't? And do you think this touches on the immediate interests of people, or does it go beyond it in some way?
I'm not sure if I understood your point about the right actually pushing through changes that like the left was originally. Can you repeat on that?
Yeah, sure. So it seems like the attempt to sort of. Okay, let me take a step back. So I feel like I kind of wanted to frame it in terms of like policies do get taken up by the state as it exists, policies that are often sort of vouched for by people on the left. So for example, you even have, I guess kind of in a reverse way, you have, from my frame of reference, Biden having to sort of followed through with a lot of the changes originally introduced by Trump, and like the general sense that like neoliberalism in society right now is in crisis, and that it's not necessarily a question of like which policies are to be implemented so much as who is actually going to carry forward these necessary changes and actually like sort of like rising up to that necessity to meet it. And it's a question really of who is doing it. And then I know earlier you talked about how a lot of this sort of change ends up getting like a lot of people end up voting for these right-leaning parties instead of the left. And like, why is it that the right has this appeal? And like, is there sort of some distinctive appeal of the left that the right misses out on, but maybe that the left also in its own moment doesn't quite understand?
Yeah. I'm still quite caught up on your first part of like green capitalism. So
that was a bit of a tangent from the beginning. So
okay, because like because I do have I had a thought on that, so I might just like go into that really quick. So basically. It's not an entirety of the EL perspective, but it's very like Leipzig focused. But we do believe that the Green New Deal, in the way that it's being pushed forward at the moment, is like very like neoliberal in terms of view. And we also don't really see how just providing changes for providing betterments for like climate change, like green jobs and stuff like that. We also do feel like as long as it's oriented by growth, it's not going to work out, because long term the resources of the planet are just going to be depleted, and so that's like really quick on that. I think we're more on the like degrowth, not really communism or socialism, more on that point of view. So we do feel like the left has to offer way different like answers if we go in that direction than like a neoliberal or even right-wing government would, because contrarian to maybe like many people who are like for like modern monetary theory or like Adam Tooze or so, the whole like direction, like we don't really believe that is actually going to change us from save us from climate change. We do believe that we actually need to cut down on a lot of like production.
But isn't this something which could also be taken up by the right, like or like what the left calls the right, like established politics, or do you think this is something which only the left could offer, right? Like that it would be kind of emancipatory in itself? Sorry for...
Yeah, that's okay. I do feel like that is our analysis is that it might happen either way. That like that kind of like I'm not sure if austerity is the right word for it, but like that people are gonna have to reduce their consumption and stuff like that, and reduce like that is gonna happen nonetheless. And also especially if we're like talking about like concepts like the global north and the global south, there's gonna be like a huge like that is the danger of the right, like actually taking up on that or being like, okay, so we need to make like authoritarian changes. We need to like push out like all the people who are not originally from the global north, and so the global north can keep on like consuming, and the rest of the world is just gonna be like, it's gonna have to. Not starve, but like reduce their consumption. Sorry, I'm starting to get a bit not very concentrated anymore. So that can be taken up by the right, definitely, and that's why we believe it needs a bigger leftist project. So there's no danger to that. I also don't really have an answer how we can avoid that. Maybe, and we can't open the room to that because it's been going on for too long. But if somebody else has ideas or has read up on ideas, I'd love to hear, because I do see how that can happen.
So then let's, in the favor of focus, have like the one last question of Ed, and then wrap it up here, and let's have a more open conversation where you can also listen.
Yes.
Outside. So Ed, last question is yours.
Thanks to you both. I learned a lot. In answer to Danny's question, you mentioned the importance of maintaining an antagonistic or critical stance towards the state. And then in answer to a question over here, you described your approach as state affirming. And I think that's a tension that's pretty common, actually, on the activist left. And so it reminded me of what I thought was maybe the most interesting point to me in your conversation, where you, Stefan, asked about the approach to the state. And you replied that a lot of the activist left in Germany, including your organization, is bound up with the NGOs and presumably bound up with other state or state-funded institutions in some way. And that made me think of something else you said, that in the We Don't Pay campaign, you saw yourself as forming a bridge from the radical left to society, by which I thought you meant like the working class, kind of beyond the usual leftist milieu, right? And so I guess my question is really about the state and the working class. I know that you are preparing to read the 18th Brumaire, and probably when you get to the end and Marx is describing the state under Louis Napoleon, you'll be thinking, okay, this is prefiguring the AfD.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, what if we imagine that in the minds of at least some working class people today, that the state that Marx is describing is the kind of state being brought about by the radical left, by the progressive activists, right? We forget, and there are some secondary works on this, that Louis Napoleon very much had like a material program for the working class, right? And he was a socialist, actually. And so keeping in mind that, that is actually the object of Marx's critique. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think how do you think that affects your ability to relate politically to the working class when your organization or the activist left more broadly are very closely bound up with the state, with the NGO complex, and they may see you not as a representative of the radical left, but as essentially a stand-in for the state, a stand-in for the NGOs. And how do you think that affects your political horizons?
Yeah. I think it influences things majorly. And I also feel like it's not only like leftist radicals, like there's always that there's a difficulty in translating things in that way. So, and also, I also don't think it's only by being like connected to like state or being viewed as part of like the this kind of social milieu in that kind of way. I also do feel like it also comes down to all the other parts of identity. For example, like I have studied. I come from like an economically okay background, and there is also something where I know you guys are not that deep into like identity politics, but I also do feel like that's the reason why we fit in with these NGOs as well, because as I said, it's mainly white, it's mainly academical, it's privileged in so many ways that so many people are just like, what do you mean? Like, I have no clue what you're talking about. I have no clue. Your concepts are way too theoretical, like for me. And also, you talk in a way that, or like you present in a way that is not relatable. And that is definitely something where the is lacking. And I also do feel like why the Don't Pay campaign or stuff like that didn't really work out for us. And there's also something about where we talk about like politics of first person, and I think like third person are like the different, like when you fight for people's struggles instead of like fighting from like your own perspective. And what we do mainly is fighting like for other people's struggles. We're mainly not really directly affected, except for like tenant struggles, or also like, but it's not really mainly like our cause that we're fighting for. And I do feel like it presents like major differences for us. What we're trying to do is, for that reason, is to educate and organizing. We're doing like regular organizing workshops and stuff like that to try to actually talk to people on like an eye-to-eye level, and to show that we can move about. And in many struggles we actually have succeeded, like the tenants struggle in Berlin. We have succeeded to connect to people that have never really formally heard of us, or were even like kind of like, we're like, what do you want from me? Academic, you know? So, yeah. Maybe hope that answers your question a little bit.
Caro, thank you so much. Everyone else, thank you.